China says the number of people infected by a mysterious respiratory virus has more than tripled over the weekend.
This virus doesn't discriminate. It attacks everyone.
So in a way, COVID-19 was predictable. In fact, it was foreseen, but for some reason, it wasn't planned for. Well, we celebrate our 10-year anniversary, and this is really the topic at this time is looking back, looking forward, is really taking stock of what we've learned over 10 years. This is a discipline that has evolved dramatically. And then looking forward, where are we going? What more can we learn? And how can we have bigger impact in the future? I can tell you as a practitioner, one thing that is striking, one thing that you learn very early on in your career when you walk through the site of a major disaster is how much of it could have been avoided. I've seen quite a few leaders and even officials freeze right in front of the crisis. And the truth is that communication is key during a crisis. And so our hope is that this session will give a couple of pointers to leaders, to experts on how, when, and what to communicate when a crisis emerges. The topic is so rich that we decided to structure it in three sections. The first one that focus on best practices in communication when the crisis emerges. A second one focus on the duration of the crisis. When you're in the middle of the crisis, how do you continue to communicate with the public or with a variety of stakeholders? And finally, a third section really focus on protracted crises that last a long time, like the ongoing pandemic, but also how to communicate to address the trauma that come with long-term crisis like the one that's currently unfolding. There's so much more that is now available and that is being used almost every day, and yet there's still so much that is coming. There's artificial intelligence, there's the Internet of Things, there's new satellite coming up every day. But we also, over the years, have learned more and more about how to communicate. And now we integrate this dimension of crisis communication. I think it's going to be fascinating, and I think it's a journey that's still going to continue for quite a while. What can we do once a risk is identified to communicate so that it's acted upon?
So today, before we kind of dive in, I would love to introduce our two panelists who are going to share about trust and how to contend with and manage the idea of risk. And we'll, from their vantage points, Jonathan is based in San Francisco, and I'm just going to ask him to introduce himself in a moment. And Margie is here with us in Singapore. And Margie is probably well known to many of you as a published author. So Margie, and Anupam, thank you so much for joining us here as well. And we'll ask that each of you just share a little bit about yourselves. And then we'll circle back around to just starting a little bit with what exactly are we talking about when we talk about trust. So actually, Anupam, why don't we start with you, and then I'll go to Margie and Jonathan. Just a quick self-introduction.
Thank you so much, Christy. I think the best way to describe myself is I'm an urbanist and a researcher, and my current research focuses on the connection between mental and social health and the built environment. And clearly we are in the middle of a crisis that has been particularly relevant in cities and how cities have responded to it. And I'm looking forward to sharing thoughts and learning from my fellow panelists and yourself in this important discussion.
Thank you so much. And Margie.
Yeah, hello everybody. I often struggle to describe what I do in my roles, but I essentially have a background in business psychology, coaching, and my work is really focused on helping leaders to build trust. And a lot of my work, it really looks at risk through the lens of human behavior, how we assess risk and how often we get it wrong and our own biases. And obviously trust has a lot to do with that too. So I'm going to be sharing my thoughts today through that lens of leadership, trust building, and how we assess risk.
Brilliant. Thanks, Margie. So good to see you again. And Jonathan.
Jonathan Hirsch with Utopia. We're an urban innovation group for emerging cities across Asia, Africa, Latin America. The work that we try to do day to day is to help build an urban ecosystem for urban innovators, urban entrepreneurs, in some of the most quickly growing cities across these three continents. We're establishing a network of city labs, really as a home for urban entrepreneurs and urban entrepreneurs in these cities. So I'll bring a lens of urban entrepreneurship today.
Brilliant. Yeah, Jonathan, I got to know Utopia a little bit doing some work with them in Kathmandu last year. So it's really exciting to welcome you on the panel as well. So this is terrific. So I guess the first thing I want to just kind of put out there is we're talking about replanting the seeds of trust. And trust is one of those words that we all say, yes, we must have trust for successful collaborations, partnerships, just families, relationships. And it's something that we kind of toss out there all the time. And so I kind of just took a pause as I was preparing for this panel, thinking, what are we actually talking about? And I went back to the origins of trust. And so if I look at a definition, a kind of a traditional Oxford definition, Oxford Dictionary definition, trust is the firm belief in the reliability, truth, or ability of someone or something. Okay, but then what are we really talking about here? Actually, it goes back to about the year the era of about 1200, and it's from an old Norse word, trista, but it means to trust, rely on, make safe, and make strong. And actually, when I think about what we're talking about today, this is what we're talking about: to make safe, to make strong, and to actually be able to build a fabric across our societies that we can rely on, not just the systems, but the people and one another. So with that, Margie, I want to toss it first to you, because you have talked about leadership and looking at human behavior and managing risks, but by building trusting human relationships. Can you just kind of talk off of that a little bit, what trust looks like for you?
Yeah, I think of trust as a currency in terms of, you know when there's, it's like you know it when you feel it and you know it when you don't. And trust is not something that can be built quickly, but it can certainly be lost very, very fast. And you just mentioned different components of trust. And I like to look at it through the lens of 4 core pillars. One of them being is reliability. Can I count on this person or entity to do what they say they're going to do when they're going to do it? The second is competence. Do they have the skills, resources, know-how, expertise to do what I want them to do, or what the kind of the implicit agreement is that they will do? Third is sincerity. Well, can I trust what they say? Do they mean what they say and say what they mean? Sometimes we wonder if what we're hearing is really what they're thinking. And the fourth is concern. How much do they care about what I care about? Are they really interested in my welfare, my well-being? Is it really about their welfare, their well-being? And so trust through a commercial lens, often when there is a lack of trust, it has a very steep hidden tax on our ability to achieve the results we want. But that rolls over to every sphere. That rolls over to the social sphere too. When there is a lack of trust, when there's a deficit of trust, it can exact a very steep hidden tax, hidden toll on our ability to achieve better outcomes.
That's so interesting. So Jonathan, from your vantage point, you're working, and actually Anupam too, and so we'll then come, but it's looking at this, you guys are very focused on you're urbanists, you're working in urban settings. Just to build on what Margie was saying, how would you build on, I love your 4 dimensions, Margie. I'm just going to kind of build on those: reliability, competence, sincerity, concern. What else in an urban setting specifically do we need to do, or what components need to be in place for people to feel safe, strong? Jonathan.
Well, I think from my perspective, one is I'm not a professionally trained urbanist or architect or urban planner, so I need to use that caveat, but I have been deeply involved in cities for the last decade and a half or so. I would say that the shadow of that, when trust doesn't exist, when there's key ingredients and the common language is not there, we often find other players step in and try to build those bonds across to fulfill what that city needs at that given point in time. Sometimes the national government and the key players that are meant to carry that trust and to be able to fulfill the needs that the disaster requires of them to fulfill, and they abdicate that trust, then other city leaders will sometimes step in and coordinate between them. When city leaders sometimes abdicate that trust with the people and fulfilling what they're meant to fulfill in that city at that moment in time, we often see civil society and business leaders step in. And I think our economies are fundamentally, our economic systems are fundamentally competitive in nature. Cities, I think, organically have grown as a collaboration. At the core of the city is very collaborative, and I think there's something with trust and collaboration that is quite significant.
So, thank you so much. So Anupam, so trust and collaboration. What happens when in an urban setting when actually we rely on systems, especially I suppose in cities? What happens, as Jonathan was saying, when trust breaks down, or you've got society, the communities that are actually questioning whether or not they can rely on those that are in charge of the systems that actually influence and govern their lives and how they live?
Yes, it's an interesting time because we are able to observe today a phenomena where we can see the consequences of actions that have been taken or have not been taken in the past in cities. And this is a moment like no other. And I feel that if we don't learn from this opportunity and challenge, this pattern will repeat. And the reality is, unfortunately, it will repeat because while some parts of the system will learn, some others will not. And that's why as a human collective, I think ultimately it's our ability to learn is what we need to focus on in my mind. And I think trust, when it's broken, is very difficult to repair. So what we're confronted with today is I think really an opportunity to sow the seeds of trust for many decades to come. And this will of course be contextual and different for different societies, different countries, different cities. But I think what is unique today is the ability to sit, for example, and have this conversation across time zones, across leveraging technology. And I think the power of networks cannot be undermined at this point. And that's where I find the role of the city is particularly important, because cities are ultimately are actually humanity's most exciting invention in a way. The city is actually a machine at one level, but a living one, a living organism, much like ourselves. And I think that's where there is an opportunity for us to learn through networks and through individuals, starting to look at objectively and rationally and following the science, what has worked and what has not worked. And share those stories and start to rebuild systems where there is fracture, where there is fragmentation, and really start to think about this with some amount of humility, because I do think we are confronted with an enemy, an invisible enemy as it's been called. But really, I think this is an opportunity for us to start also, while we're grappling with the virus at one level frontally, there is also a need to start healing and start to provide those tools and resources to communities in cities everywhere.
Oh, that's, love that. So Margie, I'm going to turn to you just in response to what Anupam was just saying. We've got, and we're in very different societies, all of us. If I look around the world, it's just kind of hard. We cannot generalize. And yet we've got so many hurting people and there's so much hardship. And I know it's for an array of reasons. What is your experience in just helping people? Some people are totally not trusting their governance, their governments at all. And others are like, yes, they've got a handle on it. And probably most of us are somewhere in between. Where do we start to, where do we start to rebuild and regain trust? One of the people that are responsible for some of these decisions, but even just in our daily lives.
Yeah, I think it's important to just recognize that as at an individual level, on an organizational level, on a society level, we tend to discount the probability of low probability events. So things like pandemics, we're like, it's unlikely to ever happen, right? And so being in Singapore, we've seen that Singapore government here immediately, I think back in January, big scale events were cancelled. And yet in other parts of the world, they were thinking, oh, that's just over there in Asia that they've got this pandemic problem going. They're cancelling big events. And everything was still churning along. I was flying out to the US to speak at great big events literally at exactly the same time. So Singapore, for instance, and because I'm here, I guess I've had more of a bird's eye view of looking at it, has obviously been through previous incredibly infectious viruses, we know SARS, etc. And so they had already invested heavily in a response that they were very quickly able to start rolling out a plan. Whereas obviously I'm Australian, but spent a lot of time in the US, and I'm actually going to be moving back to the US next. Not so much. Obviously there wasn't the same level of very coherent planning. So, you know, that's just human nature. If we've never had it, it seems like it's never going to happen to us. Whereas when you have had something happen to you, you know it can happen, even though it's a supposedly low probability event. But I think a key thing here is that we talk a lot about disaster management, and a lot of focus and resources get channeled into managing the disaster, the crisis, whatever it is, in this case, a pandemic. We need to put more into managing the risk and mitigating the risk of the disaster happening in the first place, in those low probability outcomes. And a little bit of, not an enormous amount of investment, can have a massive payoff if we put more time and effort into preparing for the very unlikely event. And I think that's where we've come undone. Many countries have come undone. And that's where at the individual, at the community, at the organizational, and obviously at the government societal level, there needs to be much more focus so that we don't find ourselves as we're just saying, that we're not going to have history repeat in 20 or 30 years' time.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because in my previous life, I did some disaster management work, natural disasters. Thankfully, I didn't have something like a pandemic to contend with, but natural disasters, working for an international NGO. And we worked on, it's called DRR, disaster risk reduction. And one of the challenges was getting funding for DRR, because it's like, oh, the likelihood of this happening is so small, we're going to invest elsewhere. So actually, being able to generate funds for preventive measures, just as you're describing, it was really tough. So Jonathan, you're sitting over there in San Francisco. You guys are still, I know there's still quite you've still got quite a situation around you, shall we say. Yes. What are some of the steps that you're taking, even just personally, and in the network that you have around you, to actually to build your resilience and to respond to what is happening around you over there?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting question, because there's collective trauma and there's personal trauma that comes with these experiences. My 7-year-old boy is being traumatized because he can't assemble with his friends at school, you know, however many months on. I remember I spent 11 years in Beijing. I still have a lot of friends, a lot of connections there. When this hit earlier this year, I was worried about them, thinking about how I could send PPE over to them. 2 months later, they were doing much better, and suddenly we went into lockdown mode, and now we're suffering and we can't get out of it. And so I think, it's also, there's the idea of, you know, post-traumatic stress from an event, but there's also chronic stress. And I think that in environments that we are, we're beholden to other key decision makers, that can be extremely frustrating. That's why I think when the chronic stress begins to set in, it's almost like being in an abusive relationship where you're not old enough yet, or an abusive family where you're not old enough yet to get out of that family. You have to deal with it, but it becomes chronic stress at that time. And I think the only way are a few of the ways to begin to address that. One is just human connection. And I think that, you know, to Anupam's point, you know, that cities are one of humankind's greatest inventions ever. It brought us together. It brought our ideas together, but it brought us together. And I think that's why I think, you know, cities themselves are extremely resilient. If you look at, you know, if for those of us who might say that cities are dead because of COVID, I think probably we just don't have a long enough lens on history. And as we look into the future as well, our cities will continue to thrive after this, because we as humans just long to connect with each other. And so I think in the small and the large ways, wherever you can connect, virtually, otherwise with your 3 closest friends, I think is really important. I think also a sense of, you know, after this is to allow, you know, when a pandemic comes or when a disaster comes, it creates a white space. in which you can, it gives you a moment to decide, either as a society or as an individual, what will come next. And yet, you know, with all the devastation, what will you do with the rest of your life? What will you do with your nation moving forward? What will you do with your city moving forward? And I think there is a opportunity for us to kind of suspend action in that white space, in that moment, and try to think about what we want to become long term. And so I think the third step after that, being okay with there's, you know, life is full of ebb and flow, and that's what makes it vibrant. To be okay with this ebb, but then to try to find, as a third step, a sense of agency. So human connection, be okay with the ebb, and then find a sense of agency, and just find a way that you can begin to build towards the future. And you know, someone once said, "I can't change the world, but I can change my world." So that might start with your family, taking steps forward with your family, with your group of friends, with your city, with your nation, just trying to find a way to have a sense of agency there. And I think just to be, underlying all of that, to be aware what trauma comes from an event and what trauma is chronic, because those are two different approaches, two different, we interact with them in two different ways. And sometimes we'll need to reach out for help when it becomes chronic stress.
Thank you. Anupam, what are you seeing? What's the white space that you're seeing around you?
Oh, so much. I just want to take that question in the context of cities everywhere at a meta level, because we've already seen the different responses in some ways. So, 100 years ago when we had a pandemic, cities responded by creating assets, whether they were sewer systems of a different order of magnitude, or parks. I mean, Central Park in New York is a response to disease. And I think that's where we need to really look at the urban condition right now, which is obviously very different than it was 100 years ago. So I think it's almost an emergency in the need to communicate. I don't know if you recall some of those disaster movies where alien attacks happen, and then of course humanity comes together and finds the solution. But if the end of those movies is very similar, where the solution is discovered in one part, somewhere, usually in the US, and then it's passed on everywhere. So this time it's, of course, in some ways, the solutions have been coming from where we live. I live in Singapore, for example, but places like Taipei, places like Vietnam, they've had a tremendous response to this. So it really begs the question, are we doing enough to communicate what has worked? And I think this is imperative for leaders everywhere at every level, whether they're in an institutional setting. They must step up and try and take this opportunity to share openly what has worked, and then to draft their own response at a strategic and a tactical level in cities, because more than half of humanity now lives in cities. And while there have some discussions already begun around, movement back to rural areas, actually that's not true. It's mostly, data tells us that it's mostly from bigger cities to smaller cities. So what we're finding is actually distribution is going to actually become more even, in a sense where we may not have very large metropolises in the near future. We may ultimately get back to those, but what we will find is more urbanization, not less. And therefore it's very important to elevate the role of communication, to really put emphasis on mimicking ideas that have worked. And there is nothing wrong with that. We have created the best cities in the world by mimicking the cities where the ideas are originally created. So I would say, if I would say one thing in the white space, is to enhance the role of communication, enhance the role of networks that are freed from, not necessarily G to G or big small to big G. It's just, form the networks organically, like to like, just like what we're doing through this event in some ways. And I hope some of those ideas spread, across the world.
So this is so interesting, because actually I remember from my disaster management days that when you look at reasons for trust in the midst of a disaster, a natural disaster in particular, but poor information flow is obviously one of the key issues. And so we're talking about elevate the role of communication, both formal and organic. How do we do that when this is a global experience, when we're having different experiences, when we have different communication capabilities from country to country, lost in translation. It's not just like we're all speaking English and English to English. I mean, in English to some other language, but even within our own, language, a single language, there's a loss of communication. We get, the bridge doesn't connect, right? How do we connect across borders, especially when the support systems that we are working with are so different? I mean, I'm just going to toss it open. Anybody want to raise your hand and tackle that one first?
I can set the ball in motion.
Okay, Anupam and then Margie. Yeah, Anupam.
Yeah, I would say that it's very important to look at universities in particular. They happen to be where you concentrate knowledge and also where we're finding the solutions coming out from. But I think also shifting the perspective around competition a little bit. I think cities often get trapped into this idea that they're competing with one another. And at some level they are for talent, investment, tourism, and so on and so forth. But at this point, I think we need to be looking at sort of co-opetition. So, compete, but really do it cooperatively, because we don't want the pie to shrink so much, economically speaking, or social capital shrinking so much that we don't have trust left anymore and we erect walls. That's not what we want. We want to have more cooperation. And we all understand that this is an opportunity to create value, unparalleled moment in history, and therefore we must focus on those institutions first.
Yeah, Margie, what would you?
Yeah, look, I agree with Anupam. I do think that part of it is what happens before the crisis too. So trust, there's been obviously a massive fraying of trust, even between regions, different between countries, within countries, but between countries as countries sort of put up their borders and act for, to protect their own citizens. Yeah. So I think where there is trust between countries, it allows for far more cohesive communication. Because I think one of the biggest challenges, biggest problems I've seen in this pandemic is just the complete lack of cohesiveness of messaging around the virus itself. It's around its contagiousness, it's around its treatment, around preventative measures, around how we can stem it, all sorts of things. And so I think that's actually caused a massive damage to trust in the public, particularly in countries where there was already relatively low social trust in what the government says. And I think that's only been frayed further, and to the detriment of, frankly, the health of people. So I think where there can be cooperation and coordination and collaboration between different voices of authority, whether they're in countries or across globally, that helps a lot. And when you've got leaders of countries undermining and discrediting and disagreeing, dismissing the voices of, say, WHO, that actually just undermines everybody. People are like, well, what can I believe? And I think that's where it would benefit enormously to have greater trust built up over the next, I think we have a lot of trust building to do between authorities, different agencies, different companies and government levels.
So then, Jonathan, just building on Margie there, what are the next steps? Some of us are in a sinkhole, right? I mean, this trust is in a sinkhole situation. Others perhaps are actually really fortunate to be in countries where actually the trust level is quite high. What would you recommend from where you sit? What are some next steps just to mitigate kind of globally where we are and take a step forward in a constructive way?
Yeah, I think versus the next steps, I probably have next questions. And I think we have entered a new era. Many of us feel the latent anxiety. All of us feel this latent anxiety that happened even before COVID. And I think it's because we're shifting between eras. And in that transition, we don't yet have the language to even articulate, much less what's happening, the narrative of what's happening, but we don't even have the emotional language to articulate how we feel about this shift and to normalize it. And so then we end up lashing out at and othering quite a bit. And so I think, what types of new institutions have yet to be built for this century that are a right fit for this century? We see this strain on the nation state as an institution. I think, we certainly shouldn't throw that away. But we didn't always have nation states. We, see the strain in some city governments. We didn't always have cities. We didn't always have chambers of commerce. We didn't always have the, WHO. And so, it is worthwhile working with what you have. There's a certain humility. I mean, approaching cities. A city is an organism much more than it is a machine with a life of its own. Not to be dictated, not to be designed necessarily, not to be engineered, but to be gardened, as Alain Bertard might say. And so I think there's a certain sense of humility of working with what you have. But I also think that I fear that we're letting this once in a lifetime moment pass us by, that we're not thinking about what are the next institutions that would serve us best for this century, because there are better versions of our institutions that we have now. There are brand new types of institutions that we don't even sense yet. They will come, whether it's 25 years or 50 years or 100 or 500 years down the road, they will come. And so I'd love to see us have more of a dialogue across society about what are the new types of institutions that need to be built and how we go about building them.
And how soon can we do that? I mean, I'm going back to actually some of the things that we've been talking about with chronic stress and, the personal trauma. Are too many people in positions of influence? Are we ready to do that? Or are we still in a white space, kind of a pause situation where we're all just kind of like still kind of reeling from this? How do we create that white space and clear our heads enough to be able to have those kinds of really thoughtful, dynamic, ideation sessions, in a sense, conversations around new institutions? That's really big.
Christy, I'll just jump in there. I think it kind of depends by region too. Obviously, in the US, where Jonathan is right now, they're in a very different place than in Singapore, where there's, we've had 0 cases now for days, 2 weeks or whatever, or in Australia, so I think it varies by region of the world. I think, speaking of trauma, we know that people are more likely to experience what's called post-traumatic growth, and are more and less likely to having a sense of purpose actually ameliorates against post-traumatic stress. And so being able to channel people's focus into things that are meaningful. How can we take all of this pain, this loss, this heartache and hardship, and channel it in a meaningful way at an individual and societal level? And I think the sooner we can move toward doing that, the better for everybody's well-being and health, and on every level. So I don't see any reason that we should be holding back doing that. I do think, though, in countries where, like, for instance, in the US, where there's, people, the pandemic is still raging, there's much more of just a fear and just managing the immediate risk still in crisis that we're not in so much now, say, in Singapore.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Jonathan, do you want to respond to that?
I agree. I think that, we have to both be able to deal with the situation, the world as it is, as well as trying to build the world of tomorrow. And so I think we need to get, if I would have any advice for a younger generation, and I guess all of us, is to get really good at what I might call the principle of oscillation, the ability to oscillate between these different tensions, between the here and between the tomorrow, between the now and the tomorrow, between the macro and the micro, between the community and the individual. And we have to deal with the risk that's right in front of us, but to use that opportunity, the pain that it surfaces a moment of reflection, I don't want that to pass us by. And I think that, when it comes to cities, we have not yet seen a truly 21st century city. Many of us might point to Singapore as taking another leap forward. And certainly along so many dimensions it has. But it's, we long for our cities to have a fundamentally different characteristic than we often experience in our cities today. We long for them to be human scale. We long for them to be adaptive. We, long for these aspects of our cities that we don't yet fully enjoy. And I think that this, again, is a chance to rethink how we live in our cities. Interestingly enough, the place in our cities in Asia and Africa, Latin America, that oftentimes hold a lot of the pain of the city, the informal part of the city, the slum of the city. Interestingly enough, for all the squalor, for all the incredibly difficult quality of life for those living there, they actually have some of these characteristics that we're longing for, that they're adaptive, they're decentralized, they're light touch, they're able to get swept away by a flood, one night, and the next night, spring back up in the same location. And so it has all these, that model has all these deficits, but actually potentially looking a bit deeper into the rethinking of the informal slums in our cities might give us a framework. We need new mental models of how we create the cities, our cities for tomorrow. And I think that we can look into the informal slum as perhaps a guidepost. Cities are trying to tell us something. So if we set aside all of our policy, all of our urban planning, all of our intentions, legislation, actions, and whatnot, what is the city trying to become by itself, in and of its own energy, before we try to layer on this sense of control on it? And I think that the world is far too complex now for us to control as an engineer, as a machine. Cities are far too complex now, and so the best that we can do, I think, is to take to reorient our relationship in how we feel that we can direct the city. I think emergence theory actually is a bit of an elegant theory that has a lot to teach us about how we engage cities, where there's not a mother bird in the flock. There's not a queen bee that dictates what everyone does. There are a few of these attractors, or that we might call them, that allow, or rules that allow the city to orient itself around those rules, those attractors, in the most efficient ways. I think we need to be thinking about what do we want to intentionally have our cities, what environment do we want to put in place that helps our cities fulfill what they're trying to naturally become. And so I think that takes a mindset shift for us.
Anupam, I know you're probably sitting there chomping at the bit to respond to this, given all the work that you've done in this area. I'd love to hear what you're thinking right now.
Well, I was listening to Jonathan very carefully and with rapture, because what he described is right out of, I suppose, a common playbook that many of us feel strongly about. And in fact, he's prompted me to share a story about my own experience over the pandemic when we first went into lockdown, or the circuit breaker was introduced in Singapore, as it was called. I made I had an epiphany, and I made a LinkedIn post about this idea, which I'm now formally researching, that, we could have more what I call conscious cities, in that if the city itself were designed, in an intentional way, it could encourage and nudge behaviors, human behaviors, individually and collectively, that enable good health. Because ultimately, we are all trying to extend our life, right? At a crude level, that's what humanity is striving for. And that's what evolution, I suppose, at an incremental level is all about. And if the city is the collective where we are harnessing this energy, this collective enterprise, would it not make sense to try and do that in a more intentional way? And I think that's where, incidentally, that I made a LinkedIn post about it, which went viral. Not necessarily TikTok viral, but LinkedIn viral. So it got a few hundred views, and so many people from across the world reached out to me, and I was just both amazed and humbled at one, that there is some merit in this idea of looking at our mental health and our social health as the entry points into urban design, and starting to make incremental changes, not necessarily look at the next mega project. And really, I thought this approach may well create cities of the future in the present, because informality, as Jonathan referred to it, is really raw human collective response to the desire to improve its well-being ultimately. So I do think there are lots of clues and lessons to be learned from the informal parts of our city, and we should try to, as we are getting better at the formality of it, maybe introduce some informality in the formal. So there are both sides to it, I think. And to me, again, communication is very important, because unless we share stories, we won't learn. And that's, we know about that, from many books and wisdom now that has been codified. I remember this book, Sapiens, which is now one of the most best-selling books, Yuval Noah Harari, and he gives this wonderful telling of the story of humanity. And it ultimately, I boil it down to in one thing: everything's a story. That's what he's basically pointing out, that everything's a story. Everything started here in our heads, and then we've actually created this collective fiction around us, which has become real. So I think, in my world of cities, I'm already doing some work with people I've never met before physically because of this research in, Urban Lab in UCL in Kathmandu, actually. So there's a really exciting era, I think, where collaboration doesn't have to wait for physical meetings and travel anymore, and we must try and adapt to that reality now.
So interesting. So if we're talking about adaptability, let me circle back around because, Jonathan, you talk about the need to be able to oscillate. And we talk about, the resilience of people that live in slum conditions, which for many of us that haven't experienced that is, and for those of us that have had the privilege to visit and talk with people there, I have never seen such joy and such a strength of spirit and resilience as I have with the people that I have met. With physically so little, and living in conditions that most of us would find unacceptable. So there's clearly something from here. So Margie, you're nodding. I'm just thinking, going back to trust as a currency in these different dimensions, at the end of the day, even to take forward this formal and informal approach, as Anupam mentioned, in a living organism that is an urban setting in a city. Where do we start just to shift mindsets and encourage new, fresh behaviors that are more constructive and help us connect with one another?
Yeah, and I think the word connect is core there. And Jonathan mentioned that too, as one of the key elements for intervening here is fostering and creating the environment for human connection, for community. We are wired for belonging. We all want to feel like we belong somewhere, that other people care about us as human beings. And I think looking at, well, how can we create the conditions, like the physical environment, the social environment, that actually fosters more and more of that. And I think at that individual level, that can make such a big difference. Looking at this through the leadership lens, how do we help also encourage people to take personal responsibility for doing what they can to improve that, for being more proactive change agents in whatever sphere they operate in. They don't have to be an appointed leader, but for people to have a stronger sense of agency in creating that change, I think is really important. And obviously that we can create that and foster that in many ways. And I think if we're looking long term here, we have to look at that from an early age in our education system and how we're fostering that agency and that connection and that sense of community from a really early age.
Yeah, because that goes to what Anupam, you were saying about we need to encourage more conscious cities. But for a lot of people, what does that mean? For some, can you guys, I'm just put a little bit, I'm looking at you guys, so I'm looking across my screen here at my panel. What's a more conscious city? What's something really concrete, just to build on this, that someone listening to this that's saying, I don't even know what the next step is. What do I do? Anupam, why don't I start with you and then I'll go over to Jonathan. What's a concrete step?
Slow down, take a pause every day, like brushing your teeth, and sit mindfully in stillness, watch your breath. And while it may sound odd to some, I'm sure it doesn't to many, hopefully as well. I think literally it's cultivating that habit and practice and skill of watching your mind, of watching your thoughts, of watching your emotions, and being okay with it, being okay with the suffering and the pain, as well as the happiness and the joy, and just being in balance. And I think if more of us were doing that in a collective, it will start to generate value and energy and action, which is more balanced. I really can't stress this more, because ultimately this is what is the wisdom that has been with humanity for thousands of years, actually. So this is not something new, but it's being rediscovered. And again, to share a story, in Singapore on the 12th of September, we actually gathered, we were fortunate enough to be able to gather physically, and we had, a few of us had created something called the Big Sit, which was an attempt to bring the community together in the central business district of all places, to just collectively sit in silence for an hour and practice mindfulness. And I was quite amazed at the response of the community. And we've now actually done a formalization of it, if you will, and we practice every month. And we've got a request from multiple venues around the city, which tells me that there is a resource that is missing. There is a resource that, you know, and a desire for social connection. I mean, think about this. This was a bunch of strangers who came together and sat in silence, didn't introduce themselves, but still felt socially connected. And this is what I hope our cities ultimately become, because that tells me that there is a safety in gathering and trust, which can be fostered with weak social connection. You don't really have to tell each other your name and profession and who you are and where you come from, but still generate a certain amount of trust. So I think for me to answer that original question, where do we begin? And Margie said it very well, we begin with ourselves. And I would just extend that. We begin with our own homes, we begin with our own families, we begin with the people we already know, and try and shift the quality of those relationships and start fostering some deeper meaning and purpose from them, and just being okay with it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's been a number of conversations on the future of work. And one of the things that is a recurrent theme is you need to slow down to move fast. And I picked up, you guys may be familiar with this book by Pico Iyer, The Art of Stillness. It's a brilliant, slim volume. And it just reminds me how important it is to just do exactly what you're describing, Anupam, is just to have a big sit all by yourself sometimes. Then in the company of others is even better. So Jonathan, what's the next step for you?
Yeah, I just actually had a question back for Anupam. Before that, a story from our side as well. Two of you know my dear colleague Dori, who leads the work in Utopia in Kathmandu. Spent a couple of years building credibility there, getting traction there, and then as we set up these City Lab platforms, that to us has meant a space as well, a space to gather, a space to collaborate, a space to co-work with entrepreneurs and innovators across the city. And we received the keys to this space, I think 48 hours before lockdown. And so that space has been largely sitting unempty for the last 6 whatever months. And so then that forces a question for us, as we have teams in Lagos and in Rio de Janeiro, and we're starting at work in Manila and Dhaka. As you know, for us, is a City Lab platform, does that mean a space? Is space still important? And I think as we've wrestled through that question, absolutely yes. When in the future possible, space is so important, but maybe less about co-working and more about these moments of collaboration throughout the work week. And to your point, you know, Christy, future of work, when I hear that, I kind of think about the future of others' expectations on us and how they dictate my schedule of work. And I think that's been a breath of fresh air with a lot of baggage as well, but this year of you know, the workplace, your company, your supervisor, your colleagues. A lot of times, you know, for us, many of us who are self-motivated, just most of humanity, is we place a lot of expectations on ourselves and how our colleagues might view us, how our supervisors might view us. Am I going to let, you know, a partner down? And so we've adopted maybe too rigid frameworks for our lives. And so I think actually, as we talk about the future of work, it is decalcifying those expectations a bit. On the edges, and yet, you know, these places, you know, to Margie's point, to connect, are, I think, as important as ever. You see people even doing this at the risk of their own lives too early, trying to reconnect, you know, over Thanksgiving or over meals or, you know, over holidays. And so, you know, in some ways, the human spirit will not be denied that chance to connect. Hopefully, we can do it in safer ways, you know, in the years to come. And so, you know, I think for many of us as leaders, I think creating those spaces, and sometimes virtually in the moment, but creating those spaces where people can gather, I think is really critical moving forward. And Anupam, as you talked about starting with yourself and meditating, breathing in, breathing out, just connecting with yourself. The question struck me, I've never had this before, of what does that look like for a city to meditate? As a city, as a being, what would that look like for a city to breathe in and breathe out and be a more conscious city? If we use that symbolism, does anything come to your imagination?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, it is, definitely.
I imagine that to a city with more equitable, accessible public space in a pragmatic way. That's what it really translates and manifests into. And I think a good analogy is a city with more parks that are accessible, well connected, probably has a correlation with more people walking and who are healthier. And mindfulness is not about just sitting, and I think of mindfulness itself as formal and informal, and mindfulness can be practiced at any point. This is a mindful conversation, for example, because we are all paying attention to each other and having a courteous, instructive and constructive conversation. And I think, similarly, mindfulness is about walking, eating, etc. So to me, if it were elevated at a community level, I think it's actually embracing a lot of principles that we have already discovered in whether it's in the real estate community or urban planning community, or even in the professional setting. I mean, when we think about the future of work, it's really about organizations, isn't it, of all kinds, government, business, nonprofit, and it's how do we manage that serendipity in a city in a more thoughtful way, because that's why we do want to live in cities. And when the stress becomes too much, we yearn to go back to nature. So how can we introduce more nature in the city in an organic way, in a way that really the collisions are not just with people at a London pub, which was 100 years ago and we still celebrate that, but in a park, in a mindfulness setting or a yoga class. So I think we just need to create that physical space which is more equitable, perhaps and ideally more natural, and accessible in a way that anybody, a child, an adult, a specially abled person, a woman, a man, and I think all of these different types do have requirements to be able to access these spaces, which sometimes we forget as planners or policymakers or real estate developers. So we really do need to cater for life in space.
I would also just like to, I agree with that absolutely, and I think what gets in the way of us doing that, even if we have the space? And so it's looking at not only creating the physical environment for that, which obviously is so important, and having greater equity of access to that, but also looking at, well, what are the forces, the cultural and social norms and forces and expectations that get in the way of those, even if we created it using it? And to me, that the leadership comes in here, because we need to look at shifting some of the norms that actually work against our well-being and against us connecting. And I think of it in a workplace setting, and obviously the royal disruption we've all had to our working lives and where we work and how we work has caused a lot of people, being a catalyst to go, well, how could I do work differently? How could I do life differently? And how can we create norms where it's okay for people to turn off, and it's okay for people to rest? And if you think through the religious context back to the Shabbat or the Sabbath, there was a day once upon a time, not that long ago, where on a Saturday or on a Sunday, I grew up in a Christian home, Sundays was the day for family. It wasn't the day for work. We always went on a picnic. I grew up in rural Australia. We always did a picnic. I know, raising my own 4 children, it's been incredibly busy with sports. So there was no day of rest. I needed Monday to get over the weekend. And so I think kind of coming back to, well, how can we shift the norms that people can actually turn off their devices at night and rest, and that we're not on calls 24/7, which is the downside of a little bit of the global world, is that we do feel like we have to be on all the time. And really bringing back and treating as sacred and precious downtime, digital free time, family time, connection time, and versus our overwired world constantly feeling like we have to be on and busy and doing and producing.
It's just so true. It's just so resonating with me. So as we are, I'm just I'm so struck at the richness. I've just been filling pages with notes, actually, of more things to think about and explore. So I guess as we're into our final moments, I would just love for each of you. This has just been such a profound conversation, and as we have final thoughts, I'm struck at something, Jonathan, that you said, which is that this is an opportunity for new design in institutions, and it's not just to be future ready, it's for now. And you said this is a once in a lifetime moment. So if we're pausing here together with all of you out there, wherever you are, and it's this once in a lifetime pause, just a moment to actually take a pause and slow down for a moment, what would you like to share? What's just grabbing your heart right now that you would share with everyone as we talk about replanting the seeds of trust? So Anupam, I'm going to start with you.
It's very simple. I'll repeat myself. Take a pause every day, 5 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds, but do it every day, and enjoy your life and the gift of life.
Take a pause every day. Okay, thank you. Jonathan.
Just thinking about how we begin to build trust and rebuild trust, I think fundamentally, feel this pain. I think we all feel this pain consciously, subconsciously, that the world has for so long been cheated out of the vast, diverse perspectives that make up the world, and we define international really as Western. And we defined, those who have, those that we've given power, in, let's say, our part of the world, the white male has been dominant. In many parts of the world, the male has been dominant. And we've missed out on so much of the wisdom and so much of the richness of cultures, of perspectives, of kind of ancient wisdom that are embedded in so many of these cultures, so many women, so many from all different types of backgrounds. And I think that, I hope this is a moment that we can, I'm actually quite, obviously we can become, I'm somewhat cynical about certain aspects of the world. And given that I sit in the US, cynical about the COVID response here. But I'm incredibly, I feel this kind of sense of childlike excitement beginning to emerge in me about all the perspectives that are yet to come over the next 10, 20, 30 years that will make our cities more resilient. They'll make them far more interesting. That future can't come fast enough. And so I think there's a real inflection point opportunity for us here to make sure that everyone has space to be able to give their perspective, not just the few.
Thank you. Margie.
Yeah, just flowing right on from what Jonathan said. I think that every crisis, and this, the wars, recessions, and this pandemic, but every crisis in history has been followed by a period of economic and social blossoming. And when we talk about the seeds of trust, I think in every adversity, there is the seed of an equal or greater benefit. But we have to be, it's not just about collective activism or what governments can do or what others can do. I think we have to be, individually be an activist in our own way and be a leader in our own way and look, what can I do to use this period of hardship and heartache and to use that as a catalyst for the highest good. And I think if everyone really looks within themselves and goes, how can I lead the charge on change? And when it comes to building trust, yes, I think we need to start acting as the trustworthy person we wish we could see more of in those who are in positions of leadership, and do our bit. Whatever your position is, you have an opportunity to impact change for the better.
And that's just actually, as you're wrapping that up, Margie, I think I have the privilege of sitting in a Center for Social Innovation. And you're exactly right. I mean, this is what we see, so much hardship and heartache, and yet, oh my goodness, we're seeing an amazing response from all quarters. And so I'm so encouraged, actually. So thank you all, Margie and Anupam and Jonathan. It has been just a delight, and it's been quite quite inspirational and moving and very educational. And there's so many things to take away and think about. And I trust everyone out there feels the same. So thank you so much for spending your time with us today.